Out of the Europe torn apart by World War I emerged the political ideology known as fascism. In the 1920s and 1930s, reacting to economic hardships, battered hopes, and a diminished sense of national greatness, more and more Europeans turned to fascism as the key to improving their lives and renewing the national spirit. Italy, whose resources and morale were woefully undermined by the war, became the first nation to embrace fascism under the leadership of Benito Mussolini. Within little more than a decade, the most powerful fascist regime, that of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, came to power in Germany. At almost the same time, a fascist regime was installed in Portugal. And within a few years, there was a fascist-supported dictatorship in Spain. A fascist regime also seized power in Japan. Throughout Europe and other parts of the world, fascism was gaining new adherents, especially in South America, where German Nazis set up a number of paramilitary organizations. Everywhere, parliamentary democracy was on the defensive, as the forces of fascism used every means, both legal and illegal, to achieve their aims. What was this fascism? Why did it arise? What was its appeal? What mark did it leave on the world? Is it alive today?
Fascism varies from nation to nation, but in its simplest terms, it is a doctrine which sanctifies the interests of the state and minimizes the rights of the individual. Nearly all fascist movements have these features in common. Fascism was born in direct opposition to liberal democracy. Fascists believe that democracy creates class conflicts and that individual freedom weakens the nation-state. Fascists also oppose socialism and communism, which intensify class conflict. Class warfare, with its potential for riots and revolution, seems to them to threaten the nation-state. From the beginning, the fascist movement has been a form of extreme nationalism, based on pride in the allegedly unique characteristics and achievements of one's own people and country. Fascist national pride often implies hostility toward other peoples, usually vented against particular minority groups. Fascist national pride often expresses itself in aggressive imperialism, since military and economic conquests strengthen the nation-state. To hold the nation-state together, fascists believe in the kind of strong government a dictatorship can provide. Such dictatorship is achieved and maintained through the power of paramilitary organizations, that is, private police forces and armies, which do not hesitate to employ violence. Fascism is a movement supported by military leaders, big industrialists, and others generally labeled right-wing. Its mass support comes largely from the lower middle class. What distinguishes the fascist movement from other right-wing parties is its revolutionary aim to replace the existing political structure with a new organization, the one-party totalitarian state. Such a state is intended to eliminate class conflict by concentrating the energy of all its members in the service of the state. The roots of fascism go far back in European history. The French Revolution of 1789 overturned a political and social order based on autocratic monarchy. The cry of liberty, equality, fraternity rang throughout Europe. In the aftermath of the French Revolution, Napoleon Bonaparte carried its ideals of liberalism and representative government across Europe. His conquests were short-lived, but the ideas he spread took root and flourished. Reaction against Napoleon's rule also encouraged a wave of nationalism in conquered territories. As the 19th century progressed, the Industrial Revolution began to spread across Europe. Capitalism developed along with industry. Capitalist entrepreneurs were usually members of the middle class. They resented interference in their affairs by the ruling aristocracy and monarchy. Accordingly, they developed the then liberal doctrine of laissez-faire, which held in part that government should not interfere with trade and commerce. As capitalists became more influential, liberal governments were brought to power in Europe, with constitutions based on the rights of the individual and with parliamentary assemblies. At this time, liberal enthusiasm went hand in hand with nationalism. The unification of Italy and of Germany in the 1860s and 1870s was a triumph for liberal as well as national aspirations. But the liberal governments in Europe often failed to satisfy the needs of two sections of the population, the working class and the lower middle class, including small businessmen, shopkeepers, craftsmen, and farmers. Many felt that liberal democracy provided a cloak under which the strong could prey on the weak. Gradually, two major doctrines began to evolve in opposition to liberalism. One was a left-wing movement, largely based on the ideas of Karl Marx and later to develop into communism. The other was a right-wing movement that was to develop into fascism. While there had been periods both of prosperity and depression under capitalism, Europe entered the 20th century on a wave of industrial progress which seemed to be stifling opposition from both the right and the left. All this was to be changed by the dislocating effects of World War I. The war brought devastation and economic disruption to all the European countries involved. 4 years of war and millions of dead led to a controversial peace treaty signed at Versailles in 1919. The treaty was extremely harsh to Germany and her allies. Even some countries on the winning side, such as Italy, were left with grievances. Above all, the war made many more people politically conscious, and therefore made possible the development of mass political parties. Thousands of soldiers returned from the front, expecting to be greeted like heroes. Instead, they joined the growing numbers of unemployed. Many of them found it difficult to return to a civilian existence. Some ex-soldiers joined paramilitary organizations, such as the German Freikorps, or the black-shirted Italian Arditi, organizations that were to carry out the violent policies of the right. Meanwhile, in Russia, the first communist state had been established by the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. Russian communists were preaching world revolution. Fear of communism was to prove a mass rallying point for fascist agitators. In the aftermath of World War I, both fascism and communism seemed to represent alternatives to liberal democracy. Both aimed at a completely new political organization, a one-party totalitarian state in which all institutions would conform to official ideology. Their differences with liberal democracy are shown in the following charts. On these charts, communism and fascism appear to have much in common. But in many respects, fascism and communism are almost diametrically opposed to each other. Communism advocates rule by and for the working class. Communist dictatorship is supposed to be only a prelude to total self-government by the people. Fascism advocates rule in the interests of the state as an end in itself. Communism seeks its support from the working class. Fascism draws its supporters from all classes, but principally from the lower middle class and the economic elite. Communism emphasizes class differences. It seeks a social revolution by the working class. Ultimately, it advocates a classless society with no private ownership of land, industry, or utilities. Fascists aim to end class conflict by making all classes serve the state. However, class structure and private ownership of the means of production are retained. The communists seek international unity of the working class in all countries. Fascism is a movement based on extreme nationalism. The communist ideology expresses concern for the individual. The fascist ideology places the interests of the state over those of the individual. Fascism takes its name from the Italian Fascisti, a movement led by Benito Mussolini. In 1922, when Mussolini came to power in Italy, he became the first fascist dictator in Europe. Italy was a poor country by European standards. She lost more than 600,000 men in World War I. At Versailles, many of her territorial claims went unfulfilled. In the wake of the war, she suffered acute depression and mass unemployment. Social unrest spread. In the cities, strikes broke out in heavy industries. In the countryside, peasants burned crops and destroyed livestock. Meanwhile, armed bands of discontented young men, many of them ex-soldiers, roamed the streets, brawling with communists and other workers, with the tacit support of the police. Most prominent among these street bands were the fascists, who adopted the black shirt as their emblem. Although at first they had no clear aims, the fascists, under the leadership of Mussolini, gradually developed a program. Its keynote was strong nationalism, fed by bitterness over Italy's unfulfilled aspirations at Versailles and a longing for past grandeur. Its other central idea, reflecting Mussolini's earlier adherence to socialism, was the corporate state, a system of government in which trade and professional organizations would form the basic units of society. Mussolini did not rule out the use of violence to achieve his ends. However much one may deplore violence, it is clear that to make our ideas penetrate people's minds, we have to play upon refractory skulls to the sound of cudgel blows. Through a combination of violence in the streets and Mussolini's persuasive oratory, the Fascist Party gained in strength. By 1921, the fascists had captured 35 seats in the Italian parliament. As Italian politics degenerated more and more into street fighting, Mussolini saw his chance to gain power. In October 1922, he mobilized his black shirts for a march on Rome, depicted here by the Italian artist Tato. Mussolini's forces converged on the capital, while he remained at a safe distance in Milan. Fearing civil war, King Victor Emmanuel III refused to impose martial law. The cabinet resigned, and Mussolini was declared premier. The fascists had come to power legally. When Mussolini came to office in 1922, he had a year's emergency powers to restore order and introduce reform. In fact, his emergency powers were not to be relinquished until 1943. In In the 1924 elections, the fascists used intimidation and strong-arm methods to suppress opposition. From 1925 on, Mussolini consciously set out to establish a totalitarian state, giving the Fascist Party complete domination over all facets of Italian life. Mussolini adopted the title Il Duce, the leader. His advisors were a fascist Grand Council, all nominated by Mussolini himself. But Il Duce never gained absolute power, as Hitler eventually did in Germany. The Italian monarchy continued to exist. And after coming to terms with Mussolini in 1929, the Catholic Church also retained considerable power. Perhaps because its power was shared, Italian fascism never went to the extremes of German fascism. However, the fascists quickly abolished all political opposition. By 1926, censorship of the press was complete. Political parties and trade unions were ruthlessly suppressed. All culture had to conform to the party line. Imitation of the massive grandeur of classical styles was encouraged as a symbol of the glorious past and the glorious present. The government made a genuine attempt to alleviate hardship. Its impressive public works included the draining of the Pontine marshes near Rome. Major roads were also built. Unemployment was reduced. The government encouraged women to have more babies, inspiring them with the maxim that numbers mean strength. Mussolini said, "Fascism is the dictatorship of the state over many cooperating classes." In order to carry out this idea, the fascists developed the corporate state. By coordinating all enterprise in the interests of the state, the fascists hoped to eliminate class conflict and to increase production. 22 corporations were established to regulate the different trades and industries. An economic parliament based on these corporations replaced the Chamber of Deputies in 1938. The fascists believed that the legislature should represent economic rather than political groupings. In reality, however, the corporate state changed little in either economic or social terms for the vast majority of Italians. It served mainly to prop up capitalism as it already existed. Plans to raise workers' wages were formulated, but these were cut short by the Great Depression of the 1930s. Yet even through the Depression, the Fascist Party retained large-scale support. Skillful propaganda bred a sense of identification between the nation and the Fascist Party. Mussolini had given the common people a sense of commitment. This was expressed in the numerous uniforms and in the fascist youth movement, which indoctrinated young people in the ideology of the party. It was expressed in mass political meetings and in total identification with Il Duce, the symbol of Italian greatness.
20 milioni a un cuore solo, una volontà sola, una decisione sola. Saluto al Duce!
Mussolini's fascist revolution in Italy had been welcomed by many people in Europe as an acceptable alternative to parliamentary liberal democracy. But when the fascist revolution spread northward, to Germany, it was to take on a more menacing tone.
Fascism came to power in Germany for many of the same reasons as in Italy: intense nationalism, resentment against the Treaty of Versailles, fear of communism, unemployment, widespread contempt for the Weimar Republic, and rampant political instability all combined to make many Germans eager for the charismatic leadership of an Adolf Hitler. Although Hitler and his followers used many of the same methods employed by the Italian fascists, combining strong-armed tactics with skillful propaganda, they added a new element, anti-Semitism, which is shown in this poster linking the number of unemployed in Germany to the number of Jews. The Great Depression helped Hitler's rise to power. In January 1933, with the country in economic and political chaos, President Hindenburg appointed Hitler Chancellor. In February, just 6 days before a national election, the Reichstag, the building housing Germany's lower house of parliament, mysteriously burned. The Nazis blamed the communists. In the anti-communist frenzy that followed, Hitler was granted temporary dictatorial powers. These were to last 12 years, until Hitler's death in 1945 during the final months of World War II.
Hitler called his new regime the Third Reich and spoke continually of the Nazi Revolution. The first step in Hitler's revolution was to destroy political opposition. Within 18 months, all of Hitler's opponents, even those within his own party, had been eliminated. Hitler assumed the title of Führer, or leader. With the aid of his feared stormtroopers, a special elite Nazi police force, he set out to create a totalitarian state in which he and his party would dominate every aspect of German life. Labor unions were abolished, and workers were deprived of their right to strike. A Nazi organization called the German Labor Front dictated conditions of work and pay. But at least there was work. Hitler had come to power in the midst of the Depression when 6 million Germans were unemployed. Now, massive public works and a large-scale rearmament program revived the German economy. But economic revival alone did not account for Hitler's popularity. His personal magnetism and his use of skillful propaganda attracted mass support. Hitler inspired his followers with hope for a strong, expanding Germany. At the same time, he preached hatred of the Jews and proclaimed the purity and superiority of the so-called Aryan race. A youth movement in the schools and universities indoctrinated the young in Nazi concepts and ideals. Within a few years, Germany was turned into a huge, disciplined war machine. Committed to Germany's expansion as a major world power, Hitler was deliberately preparing for the conflict this might entail. Today, Germany, went an ominous slogan, tomorrow, the world. At home, few Germans objected to this kind of propaganda, which depicted the Jew as an evil, money-grabbing communist. Nor did they object to the Nuremberg laws of 1935, which deprived Jews of all rights as citizens. As the Third Reich progressed, anti-Semitism became more fanatical. Jews were hounded, beaten, driven from public office, and their property was confiscated. The Nazis established a network of concentration camps where thousands were confined without trial. This policy culminated in the slaughter of 6 million European Jews during World War II. The 1930s was the age of fascism. Throughout Europe, small fascist movements sought to replace the existing political structure with a new one. Nor was fascism confined to Europe. In Japan, a militaristic and nationalist government under Emperor Hirohito had developed its own brand of fascism. Japanese aggression was shown in the 1930s by the seizure of Manchuria, a part of northeast China. From that time on, Japanese fascism pursued an increasingly militaristic course, culminating in the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, which brought the United States into World War II. But the most extensive fascist gains were in Europe. In Portugal, following a military coup in 1926, Dr. Antonio de Oliveira Salazar set up an economic dictatorship based, as in Italy, on a corporate state. Salazar's regime developed many features of the fascist state in cooperation with the Catholic Church in Portugal. In neighboring Spain, an almost pure form of fascism was to be found in the doctrines of a small party called the Falange, led by José Antonio de Rivera. But the Falange was only a minority party. Spain was a backward peasant country with little industrialization and therefore a small middle class. Unlike in Italy or Germany, support for a mass fascist party was lacking. The same was true in many of the countries of Eastern Europe, where fascist organizations would have remained permanently on the political fringe had it not been for increasing German support. During the late 1930s, and later during World War II, Germany was to establish fascist puppet regimes in the countries she came to dominate. Hitler's hold on Mussolini grew especially strong. Fascism throughout Europe adopted a German, and therefore an anti-Semitic tone, even in Italy, where there were few Jews. As the 1930s progressed, fascist foreign policy became increasingly aggressive. In 1935, Italy attacked Ethiopia, one of the few independent African states. Ethiopia protested to the League of Nations without avail. But the adventure in Ethiopia brought Italy and Germany together. Other European countries deplored this aggression, and only Germany offered friendship. This was cemented by the signing of the Axis Pact between the two nations in October 1936. Meanwhile, in the summer of 1936, civil war had broken out in Spain. The combined forces of the right, the military, the monarchists, and the Falange attacked the legal Republican government. While Russia gave propaganda support and arms to the Republicans, Italy and Germany gave massive military aid to the rebels. The Nazis exploited the Spanish conflict as a testing ground for new and dreadful methods of warfare. German pilots carried out the systematic bombing of civilian populations. In 1939, the Spanish Civil War ended. The rebel forces under General Francisco Franco had defeated the divided Republicans. Franco's long dictatorship over Spain had begun. Meanwhile, buoyed by the success of German forces in Spain, Hitler had been pursuing an aggressive foreign policy. In March 1938, his troops crossed the Austrian border and absorbed that country into the Third Reich. Hitler now aspired to a German-dominated Europe. His demands for the Sudetenland, a part of Czechoslovakia he considered German, were granted at the Munich Conference in September 1938, as the Western democratic powers pursued a policy of appeasement. Hitler then seized all of Czechoslovakia. Finally, in 1939, the Western democracies made their stand. When Hitler's troops invaded Poland on September 1st, Britain and France declared war on Germany. World War II was a war for which Hitler had prepared, but it was not the war he had planned. After 6 terrible years of bloodshed, the Allies, Britain, France, and later the Soviet Union and the United States, defeated the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan. At the end of the war, Hitler and Mussolini were both dead, and their armies defeated.
The fascism of Hitler and Mussolini was discredited and suppressed, as was that which had developed in Japan. But fascism itself was not destroyed. In Portugal, the fascist Estado Novo, established by Salazar, lasted until 1975, 5 years after Salazar's death. In Spain, General Franco's regime remained in power until 1975, when Franco died. King Juan Carlos, Franco's successor, then began to dismantle the Francoist system and to introduce parliamentary democracy. In Greece, members of the military seized power in 1967 and established a regime that many observers considered fascist. In 1974, the military government was forced from office and replaced by a parliamentary democracy. By the end of the 1970s, there was no fascist government in power in Western Europe, but fascist organizations were active in most Western European countries, including West Germany, in Japan, and even in the United States. But the most recent examples of fascist or quasi-fascist regimes, according to many scholars, have occurred in the developing countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, where traditional societies are undergoing the agony and confusion of rapid modernization. In many of these societies, parliamentary government was alien to the institutions and patterns of life, and was often imposed by a departing colonial power. Repeatedly, such governments have given way to a charismatic leader whose program has often borrowed from the Mussolini prototype. This was true of the regime established in Ghana in the 1960s by Kwame Nkrumah, whose ideology emphasized the nation rather than the working class, production of goods rather than more widespread distribution, and the expansion of Ghana over much of Black Africa rather than economic and social equality within Ghana. In Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, although he flirted with the Soviet Union, gave the country a constitution in many respects similar to that of fascist Italy. For example, the seats in Parliament were apportioned according to social classes, with preference given to industry, the professions, and the bureaucracy. In Libya, once part of Mussolini's Italian Empire, Colonel Gaddafi set up a Muslim fundamentalist regime with many of the attitudes, policies, and trappings of the classic fascist state. In South America, the military has traditionally been the strongest force in politics. In addition, since the 1930s, many South Americans have been overtly sympathetic to fascist ideology. In Argentina, the regime of Juan and Eva Perón was openly fascist, as was that of General Alfredo Stroessner of Paraguay. The excesses of the Peróns led eventually to their overthrow. But other Argentinian regimes since the Peróns have retained characteristics of fascism. This is also true of military regimes in such countries as Brazil and Chile. In each of these countries, the regime's avowed aim upon seizing power is to give the nation political stability, which includes suppressing so-called subversive elements, increasing economic productivity, and renewing the national spirit, which was briefly achieved in 1982 in Argentina by the attempted seizure of the Falkland Islands. With time and outside political pressures, as from the Pope, for example, some of the regimes become less repressive of human rights. And with time and internal pressures, some of the regimes are overthrown. But as many scholars point out, the turmoil and confusion attending modernization of traditional societies remains, and so do the conditions giving rise to fascism.